Hi, all. I'm here today with Ralph Stefan Weir. He is a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Lincoln. Recently wrote a book. What is the title of the book, Ralph?
The Mind-Body Problem and Metaphysics.
Yes. Out with Routledge. It's a book about whether you have a soul. And today we'll be talking about whether you have a soul. Speaking of which, if you do have a soul, subscribe to this channel. Okay. Yeah, so uh two two terms we'll be using a lot: substance dualism, property dualism. What are those, and what are the alternatives to them?
Yeah, so often in introductions to the mind-body problem, you just get people say, well, you've got three basic options: physicalism, idealism, or dualism. Physicalism, it's all physical. Somehow, if you have a mind at all, it's physical. Idealism, it's all mental. Somehow physical objects are really just figments of the imagination or something like that. Somehow they're mental. And then dualism, there's both mind and body. But starting in around the 1970s, you started to see this distinction between property dualism and substance dualism. And the simple answer to the difference between these two views is that property dualism says, yeah, the mind involves some non-physical properties, but it doesn't involve any non-physical substance, whereas substance dualism says, actually, the mind is a non-physical substance in addition to the body. Now, that's how people usually use these terms. That, of course, doesn't tell us much unless we know what the meaning of the word property and substance is here. And funnily enough, most of the people who've used these terms, who've kind of set the agenda for current philosophy of mind, do not explain what they mean by these terms. And so part of the project of the book was to work out, well, what ought we to mean by this distinction, if such a distinction can usefully be made? And the answer I came to was that in the context of the mind-body problem, it makes sense to think of a substance as anything that can exist separately by itself, maybe with one or two qualifications, whereas a property is something that has to belong to something. So here's a copy of the book. The shape of the book can't be taken apart from the rest of the book over here because it's a property of the book, but a page of the book could be torn out. Of course, I would never do that. And held over here because it's not merely a property of a book, it's a substantial part of the book. I think that's the crucial difference. Substance dualists think your mind, or perhaps soul, is not only immaterial, but it could exist separately from the body, whereas the property dualist says that could not happen.
Yeah, very good. Early on in the book, there's an interesting chapter discussing the fact that substance dualism, the idea that you have, and you are or have this immaterial substance that is responsible for your mental life, etc. That's been pretty much like the received common sense view among philosophers, among ordinary people in different societies, pretty widely, cross-culturally throughout history. We are quite unusual in that at least the intellectual culture of our society, not only is it not the received view, that it's kind of obviously false is often the received view, at least it is in philosophy. And not only that, there's kind of an interesting phenomenon where anthropologists, theologians, historians, etc., tend to not only think that substance dualism is false, but also deny that very many people ever believed it in the first place. They portray it as kind of this odd, idiosyncratic view that Plato and Descartes believed in, and some misguided philosophers who followed them. But like, obviously, the vast majority of people never believed any of this stuff, they think. So I guess kind of a series of related questions. How is it that we know that, or at least what is the argument for thinking that, no, actually this has been a very, very widespread view. It's not just something that a few weird philosophers thought up. And then why is it that modern philosophy and modern intellectual culture takes it as so beyond the pale? How did that shift happen? And then what do we think explains the tendency to deny even that it was ever a popular view? I guess plenty of people, people nowadays don't accept geocentrism, but they don't argue that nobody ever accepted geocentrism. So it's a little, if we think the evidence is compelling that it was a widespread view, there's also kind of something interesting about the fact that I told Ralph earlier that my cat might hop up. There's also something interesting about the fact that there's this push to deny that it really was ever even widespread at all. So
there's three super important questions there, all of which I'm extremely interested in. The first is, I think, the easiest to answer. How do we know that substance dualism was the go-to position for most human cultures at most points in time globally? Well, I think you really only need to look at the sources, and even nowadays look at the latest scholarship, because while it is absolutely true that there's a huge amount of material out there that tries to represent substance dualism as a niche position, in many areas this idea has been pretty decisively refuted, like by Edward Singland with regards to Chinese philosophical views, by Thomas McEvilley with regard to ancient Egypt, and there are lots of excellent interventions. So if you look, I mean, my opinion at least is, if you look with an unbiased view at the sources we do have about traditional cultures, what you find is that again and again in the literary sources, it's taken for granted that we can make sense of the idea of someone surviving, continuing to have a mental life after bodily death. Well, that idea only makes sense if there is something which satisfies my definition of a mental substance. It has a mental life, it has mental properties, it doesn't have physical properties, and it can exist without the physical body or any other particular physical body. So I think it's pretty clear from the literary sources. It's also the case that in anthropology, there's very good evidence that some form of what gets referred to slightly misleadingly as ancestor worship, but some form of the idea that our ancestors continue to exist, continue to participate in the community, is part of almost all religious traditions we know about the world over. Again, this is an idea that seems to presuppose a dualism, substance dualism of mind and body. And then thirdly, there's modern developmental psychology, in particular the work of Paul Bloom and Jesse Bering, which seems to suggest that even very young infants today, prior to the influence of surrounding culture, reason in a way that presupposes that mind and body are distinct and separable. So I think it's pretty overwhelming evidence that we know that is the view to which people are intuitively drawn. The second question was, why do we in contemporary Western intellectual culture regard this as a completely ridiculous anathema view, something no one could possibly be attracted to without being brainwashed by Descartes or something like that? That I find much harder to answer, and I haven't drawn a satisfactory conclusion myself. However, I think the official answer is that it's got to do with the causal closure of the physical world. We discovered scientifically that every physical effect has a sufficient physical cause going back in a chain all the way back to the Big Bang. And therefore, we can see that a non-physical mind could never act causally on a physical body, like my body, my nervous system, my brain. And yet it seems perfectly clear that if my mind were non-physical, immaterial, then it would have to be a non-physical thing that acts on my body. For instance, when I feel hungry and go look for some food, right? And so what they conclude is that must be some kind of mistake. Really, the mind just is in some sense the brain, or is nothing more than the brain. That's the official reason. I do not personally buy that that's the actual sociologically explanatory reason why people tend to take the view that substance dualism is so ridiculous today for a couple of reasons. One is that people turned on substance dualism before the causal closure argument became prominent in intellectual circles. The Great Rebellion against substance dualism started at least as early as Gilbert Ryle in 1949 in the concept of mind. The causal closure argument doesn't start to get an airing until about a decade after that. And secondly, at least my judgment is that the causal closure argument depends on this premise that we know that the physical world is causally closed. Every physical effect is brought about by a chain of sufficient physical causes, which is, well, I mean, I have immense admiration for proponents of this argument. Many brilliant thinkers have put it forward in a sophisticated fashion, but that core claim seems to me to be essentially just made up. It's just not the case that we have good evidence for that in the case of animate organisms. And so I don't think that's really what pushed people to this conclusion. Rather, they had this idea already that substance dualism can't be true for some other reason, which is a bit mysterious to me, and then came up with this argument to rationalize that conclusion. The third question was, why did people start denying that substance dualism was so popular historically? As with the second question, I find this pretty mysterious, but I think a couple of useful things can be said in answer. One is that once you've decided that a view is false, you naturally have a cognitive bias towards wanting to see other people agreeing with that, right? If everyone disagrees with you, you start to feel a certain degree of cognitive dissonance, especially if they're people who you want to be on your side. So if you're, for example, a conservative biblical theologian who has accepted materialism, and then you see St. Paul saying we'd rather be away from the body and with the Lord, you feel, I don't want Paul to be saying that. Or if you're a sort of progressive anti-Western sociologist, and you see an indigenous community you're studying talking about how their ancestors continue to exist after death, you think, oh no, I don't want them to say that, because I'm studying this source because I have a wider view according to which I should be able to learn from it. So I think that's a pretty clear reason why people might want to play down what is already an unpopular view in contemporary Western intellectual culture in whatever we study. Whether that fully explains this, I doubt. I think there's probably quite a complex, rich story to be told about how what I call psuchophobia, hatred of the idea of the soul, has become more or less ubiquitous, not only in contemporary philosophy, but also in our scholarly and sociological work on various cultures and traditions. Yeah, I think there's much more work to be done explaining exactly why that's come about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to recap, so in terms of why I think that belief in substance dualism has been a widespread view, the answer is, well, it's actually not controversial that it's been very widespread to think that humans have some immaterial part, some spiritual part or something that can survive death, that can exist apart from being embodied. And in philosophy, that almost automatically commits you to dualism. I mean, if you have there's something about you that can survive, you can maintain your identity while this immaterial mental thing survives. Yeah, that pretty much just is dualism.
If you put forward that view in a philosophy of mind seminar,
yeah,
people will say, "Oh, so you're a dualist," and if you deny it, they'll think you're splitting hairs somehow.
Yeah,
basically, you're a dualist if you substance dualist.
Yeah, and one point you make in the book is that people writing about this who portray dualism as this odd Platonic Cartesian aberration, often they'll say things like, yes, the Bible or such and such culture or whatever. Yeah, they believe in this immaterial soul that survives death, whatever. But that doesn't mean that they're dualists. They have a more holistic picture on which body and soul are integrated, and
Mhm.
embodiment is a good thing and whatever. And so yeah, that leads me to think really what's happening is that a lot of times people are conflating the metaphysical thesis with a bunch of ethical or social connotations that they attach to dualism. Um, and
Yeah,
that's really what they're denying. It's not that they're denying that the Bible says that you have this immaterial part or whatever. It's that or I mean, sometimes they are, but what the most important thing for them is to be denying that the Bible thinks that your body is a prison that you should
yeah.
try to escape from or something like that. And that's what they mean by dualism.
I
Um,
think that's absolutely right, and it's a really important clarification. My So far as I can tell, it is true that sophisticated philosophical dualist theories in the Western tradition uh, enter with people like Pythagoras and Plato under the influence of Eastern philosophical thought, in which you do have this idea that embodiment is a kind of trap. We're stuck in the wheel of samsara, and we're trying to get out to moksha or nirvana or something. It's and it's definitely true that early Christian thinkers, including the authors of the Bible, aren't affirming that. Neither, of course, is Descartes, uh, uh, great persona non grata for anti-dualists. But nonetheless, so there is totally legitimately a use of the word dualism, if we're clear about what we mean, which implies this evaluative judgment that the soul is good and the body is evil, or that the soul is more important than the body. Well, even Christian thinkers tend to think at least that. But so long as we're clear about our terminology, that I think is totally um, unproblematic. However, I don't think it's just a case of people talking past one another, because if that were all it was, we could clarify our terminology and say, oh, but all I mean by dualism is the sense that is used in contemporary philosophy, where we mean there is this non-physical thing in addition to the body, and if it's substance dualism, it's a separable thing, something that could exist without the body. But my experience is when you clarify like that, it doesn't satisfy people. They still will tend to be deeply against applying the word dualism to historical or to the various traditions they're studying. And moreover, there are certainly cases in which my impression is people start by arguing against the sort of evaluative dualism, the idea that embodiment's bad and the soul's good, and then draw the conclusion without any extra auxiliary premises that therefore we are just our bodies, or there is no soul-body distinction, or any distinction between soul and body is to be objected to. And it seems to me that jump suggests that, that these two ideas get conflated in a way that leads to shoddy reasoning, rather than it just being a case that different scholarly communities have different definitions of the words, and we'd all agree if we could get the definition straight.
yeah, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I was trying to think through the other day what is like the causal order here with all these. Yeah. Um, I wonder if part of it isn't because what another thing you talk about in the book is there is this tendency to tell kind of grand narratives about how dualism is responsible for a range of social ills.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing you didn't talk about is and that I think also calls these narratives into question is that people on both sides tell these stories, like both political perspectives. So there's kind of a left-wing story about how dualism is associated with embodiment being bad, etc. And so that means that it's responsible for environmental destruction because you'll think of the world around us as merely instrumental to be used however we want. It's responsible for being sex negative because you'll think of your body as a shameful thing, etc. It's responsible for being anti-feminist. But there also is a narrative you get, say, from some conservative Catholic ethicists who want to say, yeah, dualism is very bad because it leads to oops. Sorry, we froze up for a second.
Sorry, you cut out for a moment there.
Yes.
Repeat the question.
Yes.
I got so far as conservative Catholics.
Yes.
Zoom objective.
Yeah, I can cut out the frozen bit. There's also sort of a narrative you get from some conservative Catholic ethicists where that's something like dualism leads to say sexual libertinism because you'll think of your body as merely an instrumental thing you can use to get pleasure. So they have a similar claim that dualism leads to all these things they oppose, but it's often things that are like the opposite of what the leftists think dualism leads to. And so I suspect there what's happening is that people think that dualism is obviously false, and then it becomes attractive to attribute all of your opponent's views to, oh, that's because they're tacitly basing these on some form of dualism. And that leads to, or that encourages this sort of conflation of dualism, the metaphysical position, and dualism, the kind of nebulously defined evaluative position where it's just everything you don't like. And so it becomes such a loaded term that, yeah, you really don't want to apply the word because it takes on, it's like the root of all evil almost, because people have these political narratives about it.
Well, I think, yeah, it's exactly right. It's one of the reasons why it's kind of, I don't know, why it's attractive to me to work on this topic. It is, yeah, it's not a simple case of, although it comes up not in ordinary, like real political life where we're deciding what legislation we want and so on, but in the intellectual political discussions, it comes up all the time. And it is one of these funny things. All sides, when they bring up dualism, they represent their opponents as somehow presupposing or drawing their views from an implicit dualism. And in every case, it's fairly easy to point out apparent historical cases that contradict their narrative. So, you mentioned the feminist idea that dualism leads us to hold the body in contempt, and because of a historical association of females with the body, it reinforces patriarchy. But then you look back in history and you find Mary Astor using Cartesian dualism to defend the equality of women with men. Or you mentioned conservative Catholics, again, seeing dualism as an excuse for not caring about what goes on in our real physical interactions with one another. But then you look back and you find Gregory of Nyssa putting forward the only ethical opposition to slavery in the ancient world on the basis of his, roughly speaking, Platonic soul-body dualism. So I don't find these narratives at all convincing. I think, and I don't think no one really ever tries to make them convincing either. People, they tend to be speaking to people who are already persuaded, or they're painting a picture for the purpose of communicating something else. But they don't tend to try in a scholarly, rigorous way to make the narratives convincing. But it's absolutely true, and I think your analysis is right. That it's a case where, funnily enough, people on all sides think this one idea is dreadfully bad. And so they're all tempted to pin it on one another as the source of their more specific errors.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I mean, most people have been dualists. Most people have thought at least some bad stuff. And anybody who's at all systematic is going to try to fit these together
You'll
somehow.
find some examples
Yeah,
where the
yeah, right.
dualism and the bad
So
stuff
it's not
come into
surprising
contact.
that there are
Sadly.
examples, but most of the good people have been dualists too. So like, yeah, that suggests probably, uh, abstruse theses in philosophy of mind have not been driving all these big social,
Yeah. I mean, not in a simple way. I mean, I don't think it would be intuitively, we think these do affect us in our personal lives, like how we conceptualize other people. It is important. I just suspect it's very, very complicated. And
Yes,
so
yes, yes.
you need to really put forward a detailed line of reasoning, working with a lot of evidence to try and
Yeah,
paint a picture of how these really influence our ethical lives.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And we'll come back to that at the end a bit, maybe. And also later we'll come back to the question of objections to dualism. One thing, what do you think about, speaking about historical dualists, what do you think about hylomorphism? Because a lot of people think, oh, hylomorphism is a philosophical tradition that is non-materialist, but also kind of somehow threads the needle between substance dualism and materialism.
So I have a great deal of time for hylomorphism on roughly the same grounds that Aristotle puts it forward initially in the Physics, according to the traditional ordering, according to which you need to draw a distinction between form and matter to explain how material things undergo change, and then he extends it to understanding how they can even undergo material change by retaining form, substantial change. I think that's some of the most brilliant theorizing in the Aristotelian corpus. And my inclination is to say we actually do have to accept something like that on any metaphysical theory that allows for real change. So I'm inclined to be very favorable to hylomorphism. However, I'm entirely nonplussed by the idea that hylomorphism provides us with an alternative response to the mind-body problem, to dualism or materialism. Aristotle, as I read him, and as most ancient thinkers read him and medieval thinkers read him, does not treat the idea that the soul is the form of the body as a solution to what we can regard as a nascent mind-body problem, which was, I think, recognized to some degree even in those days. He still has the idea of the intellect as this immaterial thing you have to posit to account for the existence of the mind. And it looks as though he thinks the intellect can exist separately from the body. He makes room for that in De Anima, seems to affirm it in the Metaphysics. And all of the ancient readers took this to be clearly his view. Thomas Aquinas then reinforces the view of the separability of the intellect, adjusting the view in various ways. Of course, for Aquinas, the soul and intellect aren't distinguished in the way that they are for Aristotle. So the short answer, in my opinion, is that, yeah, we need hylomorphism is a brilliant and attractive theory, which was not introduced to solve the mind-body problem. And I've never seen a plausible explanation of how it could solve that problem. It seems to me, if you look at the classic arguments, thinking that there's something immaterial, in addition to the ontology of the physical sciences, the zombies argument, the Mary argument, and so on, a hylomorphist just has to agree with one or other response to those arguments. Either, yeah, there is something extra immaterial, as Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and so on would have said. Well, then it's not your hylomorphism doing the work. You've become a kind of dualist, maybe the best kind of dualist, but still a dualist. Or you say, no, there's nothing immaterial. Well, then you're disagreeing with the classic hylomorphists, Aristotle and Aquinas, but also you're stuck in the same situation as other physicalists, needing to explain, well, why is it that Mary doesn't have knowledge of what it's like to see colors when she's in her black and white room. Why is it that philosophical zombies strike most people as not logically incoherent? And the form matter distinction, it seems to me, doesn't help you with those questions.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems right to me. And yeah, and I've often been skeptical of the idea that hylomorphism really provides this kind of third way between materialism and dualism, because sometimes I always have difficulty understanding hylomorphists, and it's not clear to me whether that's my fault or theirs, but sometimes it sounds like at least some
But
of
by and large, I think if you're making an effort and you don't understand someone, it's their fault. That
yeah.
should be the rule, right? In philosophy, at least.
I read Eric Olson in his book on personal ontology has a discussion of hylomorphism, and at the end he's like, I'm not going to say any more because I don't understand hylomorphism. And I felt so vindicated, because sometimes it sounds to me like the soul is it's just supposed to be like a configuration that the matter is in. And then I'm like, okay, that's interesting, but this is just a form of materialism, isn't it? And then other times it sounds like, no, it's a concrete thing that can exist separately from the matter. And then it really does sound like it's some version of substance dualism to me.
Well, I mean, my opinion on this is that reading Aristotle's physics closely helps one see why that's happened, because I think there is this important argument driving us towards a form matter distinction in really the context of pre-Socratic philosophy, explaining how change makes sense, which leads to this form matter distinction, but actually does not, at least at face value, force us to say that the form is something concrete, separable, or something not concrete, not separable, just intellectually distinct. And so I can sort of see why nowadays people often refer to hylomorphism as if it's one view, but it's in fact a huge genus of different views that just follow Aristotle in this one ingenious point.
Yeah. Then the third issue was about why does everybody reject substance dualism nowadays? And we'll come back to that a little bit later. For now, so the main, or kind of like the argumentative core of the book, is this argument for substance dualism that sort of takes as its base the most influential argument for property dualism, and then argues that contra received opinion, you can't sort of just stop with that and happily be just a property dualist who doesn't believe that there's a separate mental substance. You should believe not only that consciousness, the phenomenon, is something over and above physical phenomena, but also that it resides in an immaterial substance that we are, or that is part of us, or whatever. So what is the argument for property dualism that you endorse?
So, I mean, I should say the book can be read in two ways: a more ecumenical way and a less ecumenical way. The ecumenical reading, which is sort of an artifact of the doctoral thesis it was based on, merely says if you're going to go as far as property dualism on the basis of the arguments that are popular currently, then you have to be a substance dualist. And even a physicalist can accept that conclusion. I know one or two physicalists who've read the book and have been inclined to agree with that conclusion. But the less ecumenical reading is that actually these arguments for property dualism are sound, but if we accept them, we do have to be either substance dualists or idealists. We have to accept that there are mental substances, mental things that can exist, minds or souls or something that can exist without anything physical. That leaves it open whether there's really fundamentally physical things or not. So the arguments for property dualism, well, there are 3 or 4 popular arguments, of which I regard the Mary argument and the zombies argument as the most influential and most important as things stand. And I think it's been shown pretty convincingly by Martina Niederrumelin and Philip Goff that they depend on basically the same idea. The core idea is that there is no a priori entailment from any physical description of the world, no matter how much detail you fill in, to the existence of consciousness, to the fact that there's something it's like to be one of those physical objects with a conscious life, a visual field, an acoustic field, feelings, sensations, and so on. There's no way on the basis of any mere physical description you could work out, deduct that something's conscious. And then secondly, if that's the case, and if we suppose we really know what we're talking about when we talk about physical things and consciousness, then it follows that you could really have all the physical stuff there. You could have that swarm of particles doing what they do without there being conscious experience. Maybe you couldn't, given some contingent physical, natural laws, but it's just not an incoherent circumstance. And if so, then it's not incoherent that well, if so, it just follows, in fact, that the conscious experience is something extra, something over and above the swarms of particles and fields. That's the way people tend to argue. Chalmers does it by using the idea of a philosophical zombie, an exact physical duplicate of a conscious human, just that it's all dark on the inside. Most people, after thinking about that for a while, think, yeah, there's no contradiction in that idea. Jackson does it by thinking about the great neuroscientist Mary, who knows everything there is to know about the neuroscience of color experience, but has never experienced color, and isn't therefore in a position to work out what it's like to experience color. Most people, more or less everyone, agrees that that's an accurate description of Mary's epistemic circumstance. So you get these two premises. An epistemic premise: there is no deduction from physical facts to mental facts. Second premise: if there's no such deduction, then there is no metaphysical entailment, no necessitation from physical facts to mental facts. Therefore, the mental facts are extra.
Yeah. So there's we can imagine, like, if you know everything about all of the physical stuff in this phone, you could deduce what the shape of the phone is. Say a very, very smart AI would be able to see why, given that the physical stuff is that way, the shape of the phone has to be that way. There would be no mystery left over, so to speak. So the argument here is that it's not like that with the physical stuff and the facts about our conscious experiences. The very, very smart computer would not be able to deduce, no matter how much information it had from about the physical stuff. It couldn't deduce from that in like a way that you would see, oh, I see why it has to be that way. What all the facts about consciousness are. It could, of course, if we told it, or if it maybe it has a conscious experiences, then it can extrapolate. It might be able to tell, okay, when you're in this state, you have this conscious experience. But it wouldn't have been able to predict that just using the stuff about the physical facts. And it's also not that it doesn't, you don't have the same kind of intelligible, oh, I see why it has to be that way. You just have this correlation.
Just to say something about that. Well, two things. One is that you talk about the shape of the phone, which is just an intrinsic property of it, supervenient on the relation between the parts of the phone. The phone also has functional properties. If it's interacted with it in a particular way, it will respond in a particular way. That's of course why they're useful. And the super intelligent intellect or computer thinking about the parts of the phone and their relations to one another would also know about its functional properties. That seems reasonable. Some people want to say, really, we don't have conscious experience except insofar as we have functional properties like the phone. We react in certain ways to certain stimuli. If you punch me, I might grimace. but there's nothing extra going on in a subjective field of the kind Descartes describes in addition to that. The other thing I just wanted to add was you say there's not this intelligible link, and something I'm very interested in, because I think it is applicable beyond the problem of consciousness to personal identity, free will, cosmogony, like why is there something rather than nothing, meta-ethics, and all sorts of other areas in philosophy, is what it is to have satisfactorily explained why one thing exists given that another exists. And I think quite a good proxy for a good explanation is whether people's faces light up when they hear it, or whether they go, aha, now I see it. And something interesting is, for a lot of scientific reductions, for a lot of sophisticated explanations, once you've got it, your face lights up in that way. You give that aha reaction. But for no physical theory of consciousness does anyone ever do that. At the very best, they go, aha, maybe that's nice, you know.
Yeah. So one point to make is we need our intellect that's predicting this stuff to know not only about me, but also about sort of everything else in the world. So maybe it's a disembodied spirit, or maybe it's
everything else
in another universe that's a very, very big computer that's modeling, speculatively everything that's happening here or something. But yeah, it doesn't seem like that helps. And yeah, it's interesting. We'll talk about people who deny this a little bit later, but yeah, most physicalists agree not only that we have no intelligible aha producing explanation of consciousness, but in fact that we're never going to get one, that it's impossible in principle. And the argument, I guess, for why it's impossible in principle is, you can kind of tell, maybe just like you can tell by, putting lines on a 2D plane, you're never going to produce a 3D shape, right? There are some things you can tell, even though I haven't gone through every possible configuration of 2D lines in my mind. I can tell it's like not the right sort of thing to produce a 3D shape. Physical properties, at least of the sort, there are these Russellian monists who think maybe there's something else to physical properties that's beyond what physics describes or something. But at least physical properties of the sort that show up in physics are structural properties, dispositional properties, something like that. And it looks like we can see in principle that no combination of those is ever going to produce any a priori entailment to either there being consciousness at all or consciousness being one way rather than another. And so that sort of tells us, even though it's true, we don't know all the physical facts about us. Certainly, we don't know all the physical facts about everything in the universe. We haven't run through every possible configuration. Seems like we can kind of tell going in that like this is just not the sort of thing that's going to produce that kind of link.
I have an example of this, I'm writing a new book on this, and I've been giving a series of lectures here in Warsaw about it. And I think quite a good illustration of this point is, so when I was, I guess, a child, my friend Dave and I used to like making up variations on card games and things. And we invented a fiendishly difficult version of chess, which we called royal chess, where it's exactly the same rules as ordinary chess, but you each start out with only a king. And it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult. Now, well, of course, like instantly people find that idea funny. Why? Because we see in a split second there is no way to checkmate someone in royal chess.
Right.
You can't do it because you're not allowed. And you do not have to try out the massive numbers of configurations of two kings on a chessboard, let alone the unlimited number of potential royal chess games that could be played, to see that none of them ends in checkmate. We just see it instantly. And if someone said, oh, well, that's winching up the white flag, someone like Patricia Churchland or something, we should just try harder. You'd think, no, they're mad. They fail to just think about it. hard enough. So I think it's like that with getting mind from matter.
Yeah. And so the usual response, the usual criticism of this argument is to grant, yeah, we're never going to find this intelligible link. But maybe we just don't need one. You know, you could conceive of water being something different from H2O. People thought it was something other than H2O for thousands of years. In fact, water just is H2O. We've discovered that empirically now. So you can conceive of some things that turn out not to be really possible. So maybe it turns out that yeah, the consciousness just is some physical phenomenon or supervenes on some physical phenomenon or whatever. And yeah, it's true that that's not something you could figure out a priori, but we've learned that empirically because, you know, we put people in MRIs or whatever. And maybe that's all there is to say.
Yeah, people do say that. Although, I mean, one of the funny things about this literature is that the first person to introduce that point in a really influential way, or at least one of the two, Saul Kripke in Naming and Necessity, goes on to explain pretty clearly why this is not going to help in the case of the problem of consciousness, the mind-body problem. And he puts forward an argument for the immateriality of mental states, which is totally consistent with the observation about these natural identity statements, which he regards as necessary a posteriori. Now, the details of how to respond to these cases or how to differentiate the case of mind-body relations from these cases does get super complex. And in my opinion, the most successful, the most useful approach is in fact David Chalmers' two-dimensional semantics, which is, it took me a whole summer of reading about this stuff. And then I thought, oh no, now I really see the point. A guy called Harry Cleveley as well has just published a really great article about why modal rationalism in cases like the mind-body problem, it seems impossible to evade given our best theory of semantics and so on. But the short reason for differentiating these cases is as follows. In the case of water and H2O, while it's perfectly true, you could have the concept of water without realizing it's H2O. You could acquire the concept of H2O without realizing that it's water. If you knew all there is to know about the microphysical structure of H2O, the way it interacts with other H2O particles and with its environment and so on, and you had the concept of water and you were intelligent enough, you would be able to see that H2O acting in the way it does and so on is going to be sufficient for absolutely everything we know about water, for its, you know, all of its mathematically measurable physical properties. At least unless we're going to be water H2O dualists as well, right? Whereas in the case of conscious experience, it's not only that you can have the concept of the physical stuff, the concept of conscious stuff, and not see that these are the same. We think that cases like the Mary scenario, the zombies experiment, and the parallel with royal chess bring out that no matter how much you knew about the physical stuff, you would never be able to see why it is sufficient for any conscious experience. So the cases are clearly disanalogous. I said I like Chalmers' two-dimensional semantic approach. I should say, I think Martin Niederrumelin and Philip Goff's transparent concepts or grasped concepts approach also helps clarify why these cases are disanalogous. But luckily, although that all gets very complex, I don't think it's necessary to go into those details to see where things stand, because it's not very controversial.
Yeah.
As you say, most physicalists agree we're never going to get this inference from how things are physically to how they are phenomenally or mentally. And most of them do not say that's because it's an a posterior identity like water in H2O. Rather, what they tend to say is either that there is no such thing as conscious experience as we usually think of it. This is some kind of persistent illusion or theoretical error. Or they say, yeah, it does exist, but the concepts under which we think of it are in some way highly misleading. That's how I describe the phenomenal concept strategy, David Papineau, and so on. Kind of the same idea, in my opinion. Or like, Colin McGinn, or in some moods, Thomas Nagel, they say, yeah, it is the same thing, but it's a complete mystery how. So none of them really try to make it like water and H2O, where there is no such mystery. Either you get people moving in the direction of elimination or illusion, or in the direction of mystery.
Yeah. So one way, maybe a layman's way of thinking about it would be something like, look, what's happening in the water H2O case is that water has kind of like a hidden essence. What water really is given by its internal structure, but you don't know at the beginning what the internal structure is. There are all sorts of internal structures it could have that would be consistent as far as with it producing, being being watery, right? Which is what and so it starts out, there are all these conceivable different structures it could have, and then we find out what the real one is, and then we learn what water is. And once you learn about the internal structure and you understand the scientific laws and whatever, then there is an intelligible link between the internal structure and its being watery. So it's not just some brute, unintelligible, necessary fact of the world that water is H2O. Whereas we sort of agree, most physicalists agree, that's actually not what's happening in the zombie case. We sort of agree that learning more about your internal structure, et cetera, whatever about the physical facts you want to learn about, is not going to produce this intelligible link. The transparency strategy from people like Goff, I guess, is sort of a way of also denying that pain, say, could have some sort of hidden essence. The thought being, look, pain is a feeling, like, what it is when you feel it. So like it's maybe unlike most things in that qualia, what it's like, are unlike most things, and that by experiencing them, you know what there is to know about them because it's an experience. And so there's sort of like no room for there to be something else you could learn that would produce this intelligible link, this a priori entailment, something like that.
Yeah, something. So as Goff defines transparency, you have a transparent concept of something if you know what it would consist in for that thing to be a part of reality. And when I introduce this to students, I say, well, look, suppose I ask you to think about the color red, picture it before you, and then I say, think about Dustin's favorite color. You can't picture it because he hasn't told you what it is. You still have a kind of concept of it, but you still know what it is for the color red to feature in reality. You don't actually know what it is for Dustin's favorite color to feature in reality. You need some more information. And so Goff argues, I think, extremely persuasively, that we have a transparent concept of those phenomenal properties that feature in our experience, which we acquire just by attending to them and saying, aha, that color, that sensation. These aren't completely perfect. We can be mistaken about them in some situations, but we can be really totally sure that we're undergoing experiences with certain features that we just know to be a part of reality. Whereas with the concept of water, well, I mean, I'd say it's not necessarily so different. So one complexity is you've got the primary property, secondary property issue, but insofar as our concept of water concerns its macroscopic physical properties, the way it moves about, flows, and so on, rather than the way it feels to us, which might be mental, after all. Well, we've got a concept of water there, which I'd be inclined to say even Goff might say, well, we've got a transparent conception of some aspect of it, but we can already see from our conception of that aspect of it that it's multiply realizable, and if it's going to exist in the world, it's going to have to be realized by something with a bit more detail filled in, which could be H2O, once we understand what H2O is. In the case of the phenomenal properties, my personal view is not only do we have a transparent grasp of these properties, but actually by reasoning about cases like Descartes' disembodiment argument, we see these are not actually properties of the sort that need to be realized by anything further. You don't need some more detailed reality to fill in how there is some phenomenal redness in my visual field. I think you're at base level there, and I suspect that's something some of the contemporary arguments fail to properly acknowledge, apart from maybe Galen Strawson.
Mm-hmm. So you have, supposing that establishes, okay, consciousness is something over and above the physical. You have a further argument. I think, so this position, property dualism, has gained quite a lot of it. It's still a minority view, but it's gained quite a lot of adherence over the past couple decades. Philosophy of mind has gone from a field where almost everyone was a physicalist to a field where maybe, what, a fifth, a quarter of people, something, are dualists. Somewhere.
Yeah, if you divide the different kinds of physicalism really precisely, then property dualism turns out to be the most popular view.
Yeah, it gets the plurality. Yeah. But most dualists are just property dualists. They say we're not positing an immaterial substance. It's just your brain, your body, whatever. But you also have these other properties, these non-physical properties. You want to argue that that's kind of an unstable position, that once you've gone this far, you're committed to also positing an immaterial substance. So what is that argument?
Yeah, so I'd say two things about that. One is that we are told most dualists are property dualists. That's certainly the received view in the literature. I give a bunch of quotations in the book suggesting that's the case. I'd hesitate to affirm that really is true, even of professional philosophers, let alone of people with some knowledge of the contemporary debates, let alone the whole world. I think if you looked at the whole world, you'd find most people today are substance dualists.
Sure, yeah, surely, yeah, ordinary.
If you look at people who know a bit about philosophy, you might well find, and even professional philosophers, you might well find actually substance dualism is comparatively popular. There's a whole load of stuff that comes out in philosophy of religion journals, which the mainstream philosophy of mind people tend to just ignore, but tends to be more sympathetic to substance dualism than property dualism. But nonetheless, at least the received view, the view as an undergraduate when you learn about philosophy, you're told you should take as normative, is that property dualism is totally respectable, whereas substance dualism is completely anathema. Now, yeah, my opinion is that this is an unstable view. You can't really be a property dualist and not a substance dualist, at least if you're working on the basis of the standard arguments against physicalism and for property dualism. I think the simple way to see this is just to try and think about what it would mean for non-physical properties to belong to a brain or a nervous system. And it's important to be very clear here that when we're talking about non-physical mental or phenomenal properties, we don't just mean properties that aren't named in our physical theories, that aren't definable in physical terms. So even biological fitness is not a property that features in physics. It would be hard, if not impossible, to give a definition using the terminology of physics that picked out biological fitness. But biological fitness we don't see as non-physical in the sense that property dualists like Chalmers, Jackson, Kim think phenomenal properties are non-physical. They're not just saying it's a higher level of description that doesn't map on in a law-like way to the lower level. They're saying there's something fundamentally new there, fundamentally extra, and the nature of that thing is revealed, at least partly, in our first-person phenomenological experience. The warmth of the light and the sound, the timbre of the voice, and so on. Now, I think if you just sit back and say to yourself, well, what do I think a brain or a nervous system is like? It's got these shape, size, things whizzing about. And what is that phenomenal property like? And try to imagine how this could be a property of that. You'll start to think that looks pretty weird. It doesn't look obvious that can happen. I can see how this thing can have a shape, a size, a weight, a density. I'm not at all sure how it can have the experience of seeing sunlight glimmer on the river, right? Now, curiously, property dualists never make any effort at all to explain how this happens. They don't even bring up the intuitive problem. So I think immediately you should think, if you're going to have something non-physical here, maybe it should just be a separable center of consciousness, subjective perspective, essentially a mind or soul, as traditionally conceived, because that's hard. That's not so hard to make sense of. However, I think we can be more rigorous than that. And the best way to be more rigorous about it is simply to invert the standard argument for property dualism. So the standard argument says there is no a priori entailment from a physical description of how things are to any phenomenal fact, to the fact that it feels like something to be one of these things. If there's no such entailment, then there's no necessitation from the physical to the phenomenal. Therefore, the phenomenal is something extra. Therefore, there is no necessitation, and the phenomenal must be something extra. Well, perfectly obviously, we can invert that argument, or try inverting it, and argue that there is no a priori entailment from any phenomenal description of things, even a description of everything every one of us is experiencing throughout the entire world, throughout all our lives, to the existence of anything physical. If there's no such entailment, there's no necessitation from our phenomenal lives to anything physical. Therefore, there is no such necessitation, and our phenomenal lives could have occurred just as they do without the existence of anything physical, a correlate of which is we count as non-physical substances in the sense that we're non-physical and we're separable from the physical world, where our phenomenal lives are. So that's the strategy. And the first step there, the idea there is no a priori entailment from a phenomenal description of things to the physical world, that's actually accepted by most proponents of the arguments for property dualism, or for some people use these as arguments for Russellian monism. My view is exactly the same consequences apply for them too. It's not really controversial for people who have already gone that far down the anti-physicalist route. It can also be pressed by thinking about Descartes' method of doubt. It really does seem to most people that you can coherently doubt whether the laptop is there or the phone or the book, but you can't coherently doubt that I, construed just as a subject of experience, am here undergoing these particular experiences. If that's right, it seems to follow there's no a priori entailment from your experience to anything physical. The second premise, if there's no such entailment, then there's no necessitation, then the subjective experiences could really exist without the physical stuff. Well, to defend that, you have to appeal to exactly the same strategies as proponents of property dualism appeal to defend that step in their argument. But I argue in the book that the same strategies work in exactly the same way here. I think it's hard to get around that idea. And then the conclusion just follows. The crucial difference between this line of reasoning and a traditional line of reasoning put forward by Descartes, Richard Swinburne, and others is that they've tried to argue for substance dualism, or the existence of a substantial immaterial mind, by arguing that, well, often that there's no entailment from the existence of I myself, conceived of under the first person personal pronoun to physical things, and then inferring that I could exist without physical things, or by putting forward other arguments that refer to I myself. People like Chalmers or Goff can reply to those arguments by saying, well, look, we're committed to the view that absence of a priori entailment means absence of metaphysical necessitation when it comes to phenomenal concepts and physical concepts, but maybe the concept of I under the first person personal pronoun causes extra trouble here. So maybe we don't have to accept that argument. The argument I depend on doesn't use personal pronouns, and so it's immune to that objection. There's another objection that says any argument that uses demonstratives is going to be flawed. Well, this argument doesn't use demonstratives either. And then there's a bunch of detail to work out about whether there's some other way to object. But that's the broad picture. I think, and I would just add this, that it seems to me if there were not a blind desperation to avoid positing anything that looks like an immaterial soul, the natural thing to do for anyone who recognized these conceptual gaps between the mental and the physical that haven't been accounted for by physicalists would be to posit a non-physical mind or soul that's separable, just as almost every philosophical tradition has over all of history. And although there's a bunch of details to work out, it's pretty extraordinary that consistently over the last few decades, the trend has been to posit only non-physical properties and not even to discuss why that's more advantageous than positing a non-physical substance.
Yeah. Yeah, so the thought is, we agreed in talking about the argument for property dualism. There's no a priori entailment from the physical to the mental. Here, you note, it seems like there's the same thing is true the other way. It's perfectly conceivable that I be a disembodied spirit having all these experiences because an evil demon is deceiving me or whatever. And most people grant that, I think. Most philosophers grant that. And so it looks like we have a kind of parallel argument to at least the possibility of disembodied substances. And I take it, yeah, so as you know, this is similar to kind of an argument from Descartes that gets into philosophy 101 classes. And there's also a standard objection to that argument that gets into philosophy 101 classes, I think. And unfortunately, not only does this get technical, but it's also where, because of time, I left off reading the book. So I'll do my best to present this. But I take it it's something like this. Look, merely showing that it's possible that there be some disembodied substance or other, some disembodied mental substance. That doesn't show that it's possible that I could be disembodied, because maybe like different possible thinkers just have different natures. You know, there could be a disembodied spirit, but maybe I am essentially material. And so for the argument to work, to show that I could be disembodied and that therefore I have this immaterial soul, it has to be that I could be disembodied. But we don't know whether I could be disembodied unless we already know whether I'm material or immaterial. And so the argument winds up being question begging. Maybe I was trying to think of an example of this. You can imagine, you know, those people who make like super realistic cakes that look like shoes and things.
Oh yeah, I love those videos.
Yeah, yeah. So like there could be a cake that looks like this, right? There's probably never been one, but it's perfectly conceivable. Seems reasonable to infer it's possible that there could be a cake that looks like this. Could this object, though, be made out of cake? You might think no, because if you know, like assuming that it's actually made out of wires and chips and whatever, if you replaced all the parts with cake, then this phone would cease to exist and it would just be replaced by a cake, right? So there could be something like this that was made out of cake, but this thing couldn't be. So to know whether this thing could be made out of cake, we have to know whether it's actually made out of cake or whether it's made out of chips and whatever. And for that reason, we wouldn't accept the argument that like, oh, I can imagine, I can conceive of like the thing I'm holding being made out of cake. Therefore, it's possible to be made out of cake. But if it's possible, then it's essentially made out of cake. So therefore, it must actually be made out of cake. That would be a bad argument, right? And so I guess the standard diagnosis is that this sort of disembodiment argument falls prey to that. Grant that it shows that there could be disembodied spirits, doesn't show that I have an immaterial spirit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And yeah, I do. In fact, it's funny. It's a great example. The phone. It seems conceivable this object, supposing I'm conceiving of it under certain appearance properties, like the way it feels, it could turn out, oh my God, the knife comes out, it's a cake.
Right.
Finally, in this part of the book, I discuss a very similar example, which is in Naming and Necessity. Kripke, he's talking about, could this desk have been made out of ice? And he says, well, it could, there's a sense in which it's conceivable. There's what he calls an illusion of possibility that this desk could have been made out of ice, but actually, of course, he argues this could not have been the case. Well, I certainly don't think that this response works. It does get a little complex, explaining why, but let me see how well I can do it. The core response that I think one needs to make is that when you have these kind of illusions of conceivability, in the standard examples of them, the explanation for that is that you are conceiving of something only under some of its properties. And those properties you're conceiving it under are such as to entail there must be more to it. So if you think about, the phone, if I think of it just in terms of like the object that looks like this to me, feels like this to me, I can make sense of the idea of finding out it's a cake. If I conceive of it under what I take to be all of its properties, right down to the electrons buzzing about in it and so forth, I can actually see it can't be a cake. That's why your example makes sense, right? If we know that. Now, admittedly, of course, people like Philip Goff argue, again, in my opinion, persuasively, that even when we get down to electrons, there's a question, well, what is it realizing those properties? So maybe even there's room for it to be something other than we usually take it to be, but probably not a cake in that case. So it's usually got to do with the fact that we're conceiving of something not entirely under transparent concepts, as Goff would call them, that tell us what the things we're conceiving of are, or semantically neutral concepts, as Chalmers would describe them. If that's right, then when we take the case of like my conscious mind now, we have a disanalogy. It's not the case that I'm thinking of something under certain appearance properties that I can see just by thinking about it need to be undergirded by something further. Rather, I'm thinking about something, as I put it in the book, metaphysically complete. I can see from thinking about it that the existence of these experiences as they are now does not a priori necessitate the existence of anything further. And no example has ever been given in the literature of something that is conceived of under transparent, plausibly conceived of under transparent concepts as metaphysically complete, but that nonetheless could turn out, in fact, to have a different underlying constitution. I think that's actually, the idea makes no sense. I discussed some examples where even having conceived of something under all its properties, seen they don't a priori entail anything further, nonetheless, there's still a modal difference between that thing and some duplicates of it. So in the book, there's an example, well, like, could there be an exact duplicate of my desk that is the same in all physical properties, except that it is just metaphysically impossible for the top right drawer to exist without the rest of the desk? Not because it's nailed or glued down or anything, it's just impossible for this duplicate of my desk. And what I urge is that that's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. The modal properties shouldn't. I mean, if you're avoiding substance dualism by assuming that the modal properties can fly free of the qualitative properties like that, you're really clutching at straws, I think. And it seems to me that's what someone's going to need to reply to the argument for the immaterial mental substance that precedes this part of the book. They're going to need to say, okay, your conscious mind is an exact duplicate of things that are metaphysically complete, that could exist by themselves, as conceived under transparent concepts, and yet that is not true of the one that actually exists. I think that's pretty strange. It's really hard to accept, and no one's made an attempt to defend the possibility of that happening. Really, there is Philip Goff in his reply to a paper I wrote for the Journal of Consciousness Studies special issue on Galileo's error on his book. He replies briefly with a discussion, well, maybe there's a substratum under the properties which could cause trouble here, and then I do reply to that in the book. But essentially, I don't think this response works. Moreover, I argue in the book that it would be really bad news for property dualists if it were the case that exact duplicates conceived of under transparent concepts could have different modal properties, because that would mean that although my zombie duplicate could exist without conscious experience, it wouldn't follow that just my physical body, this very one, could exist without conscious experience. And therefore, we'd have no reason to be even property dualists about the actual world. Property dualists, too, need to reason back from what we know about perfect duplicates of us to our own modal properties.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll need to read through the book and think more about this.
Yeah, me too.
As should the people watching. Go buy the book. It's very readable, actually, for a philosophy of mind book, even though we're talking about very technical stuff here.
I try to make it really readable. I think I should have probably told Routledge to try and market as a semi-popular book, maybe, to get more people to read it, and maybe they'd have provided it at a lower price if I'd done that. But there will be a cheaper paperback at some point.
What do you make of some of the other arguments for substance dualism? So I've often thought the strongest argument is one that you find in Swinburne, basically. That's something like, look, there's always some objective determinate fact about whether I exist in a certain situation, about whether somebody is me. When I think about myself, conceived of as like a subjective experience with a first person perspective, there's always some fact about whether somebody else is seeing things from that same perspective, right? And if I'm a physical object, you can imagine all sorts of transformations. Like, you take out both halves of my brain and put them in different bodies, and you start replacing parts with silicon chips, and you can imagine, because I'm like a very complicated composite object, it looks like there will be cases where, it's kind of arbitrary whether we say that, my brain survives, my body survives, whatever. It looks like there are two equally good closest continuers, and they can't both be me, but it also shouldn't be the case that like one is not me because the other exists, because that's weird. And so, this idea that like whether I exist or not is sort of like a joint cutting fact, that seems to be in tension with the idea that I am this very complicated physical object that, you can change out all sorts of parts. And once I'm at like 51% silicon, do I still exist? It's kind of hard to say. What do you think about that sort of argument, or other
Yeah.
arguments for dualism?
Well, I think that broad line of argument seems to me to be a watertight argument that if you believe we retain our personal identity over time, and also I think even if you think that there's a deep sense in which we have distinct identities at a time, that I am me now, then you have to posit something beyond the natural world as captured by our physical ontology. I think these arguments are perhaps, well, certainly equally, maybe even more interesting than the arguments about consciousness. They suffer from a couple of flaws from the perspective of the project of the book, which is that, on the one hand, I don't think these arguments entail that you're a mental substance directly, in the sense of substance that really I think matters when we're distinguishing substance dualism and property dualism. In fact, Martina Nieder-Rumelin and Donnac O'Connell really kindly organized a couple of discussions about the book at the University of Freiburg. And one thing that came up a few times was that several people in Martina's group are committed to the idea, or very sympathetic to the idea, that the self, the I, is immaterial, that it has to be so, on purely, theoretical grounds, but do not want, or are not, do not see themselves as thereby committed to the view that the I is a substance in the sense of something that could exist without the body. So you're not going to get to substance dualism. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that arguing from the attempt in the book is to argue from the premises of my main anti-physicalist opponents to the conclusion they don't want to accept, to try and just use what they're committed to, because that's the most dialectically powerful way of arguing. And if you bring in claims about there being an absolute fact of the matter at a deep level, whether I exist in a scenario or not, well, you're departing from the premises they use in their arguments for property dualism or for Russellian monism or panpsychism. Having said all that, I have, I think, 3 pieces coming out fairly imminently, 2 academic pieces and 1 in a popular publication, essentially on this issue, talking about the transhumanist idea that we could upload ourselves onto computers or something along those lines. And what I argue in all of those is, well, Parfit is exactly right to distinguish 2 conceptions of personal identity. On one, it's a deep, important fact, which is not derivable from any physical facts about you, or even any physical facts or psychological continuities. And if that's the case, we have no reason to think uploading would work. Or personal identity is some kind of trivial, conventional fact. It's just a matter of the way we talk. It's a façon de parler. And therefore, there's no reason to care very much about being uploaded to a computer. You might as well not bother.
Yeah.
And I think one way in which, an interesting way in which this metaphysical problem intersects with, fairly practical reasoning about what we ought to be doing in about the future of humanity is that transhumanists really overlook that dilemma.
Yeah. One way of responding to the argument I just gave is adopting a sort of deflationary view of personal identity, where you just deny that there's any deep fact, and so you say, well, yeah, it kind of is. Do I survive all these transformations? Like, who knows? Doesn't really matter too much. We can kind of stipulate one way or the other, or say, well, I kind of do, I kind of don't. Yeah, on that view, I actually had a conversation with a person interested in transhumanist ideas a little while ago. Yeah, on that view, well, it doesn't really matter whether you survive or not. So why are you even bothering uploading yourself? Yeah.
Mm.
Whereas, yeah, if the absolute, if the joint cutting personal identity view is right, yeah, then it seems like it does matter whether I survive, or at least it's open to say it does matter whether I survive. Yeah, but then it's much harder to know. At least you can't infer just because my psychology survives that I survived the uploading
Yeah.
process. Maybe it's worth trying just in case my soul goes along with the upload.
Yeah,
Or
the first thing I wrote about this was trying to attack the even maybe it's worth trying
oh yeah,
idea on the basis that these technologies, yeah, I mean maybe there's a really small chance you'll survive, but there's also a really small chance you'll be subjected to eternal torment by this race you integrate. We just don't know. So why is it a good idea to take a
yeah.
chance?
I
Unless you're just terrified of death and think
yeah.
anything that might avoid that, but then why think that? But yeah, I agree. Yeah, there might
Yeah.
it's not totally crazy, but there might be a
Yeah.
reason to.
I feel like if it's like they scan me and then they upload me and I'm like sitting here, then I'm like, oh, okay, that's not me, right? Like I'm still here. If they started replacing parts of my brain, like gradually with silicon chips, then I start to think, oh, maybe that is worth trying, because then it seems closer to kind of what's already happening with my brain, and like
Yeah.
uh,
I mean, I think if you take seriously non-naturalist metaphysics about consciousness, personal identity, free will, all these things, you still have to accept that there are clearly sophisticated, deep, and tremendously important relationships between the self, the conscious mind agency, and what's going on in the brain and body. And so it's not, you can't just dismiss the idea that some version of that technology would work, but you do have reasons to be at least skeptical about it
right.
for radical cases. David Chalmers has this very interesting argument where he says, well, look, suppose we replace one of your neurons by a silicon replica, and then the next month we replace another, and the next month another. And he says, well, it's highly implausible that you'd cease to exist when we replace the first one. And each subsequent exchange of neuron for silicon is essentially the same event, and therefore it seems to follow that you're going to survive the entire thing. And what I say in one of the forthcoming articles is that or maybe in all of them, I forget. I think this is based on, I think this is unsound reasoning because it presupposes that replacing the, we've got about 10 billion neurons, the 5 billion and 1th neuron has no greater effect on your personal identity or your survival than the very first one. And because Chalmers presupposes that the neurons are functionally identical to the silicon replacements are functionally identical to the neurons they replace, and assumes therefore you keep moving around in the same way and so forth, that seems kind of plausible. But of course, it's not inevitable that your personal identity survives through all of that. And so I suggest, well, look, it's pretty plausible I'd survive having one portion of my brain, a percentage, replaced by a Lego brick. And then probably if I had another percentage replaced next month, I'd survive that. In fact, we know people can survive without a fair amount. But at some point in that process, we know I would not survive. And so it seems to me if we're saying we know one survives this process only because each step in the process is analogous to each other, it seems to me Chalmers' reasoning doesn't, if it worked, it should work for the Lego brick case, and it doesn't work there, so I don't think it works.
Yeah, I was going to ask about this later, but this leads naturally into what do you think are the implications of dualism for consciousness in non-human beings? So first of all, there's a question about non-human animals, and then second of all, there's a question about AIs, which is more relevant in light of developments in AI and that sort of stuff.
It's certainly more trendy. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
more relevant to this. I mean, I'm very sympathetic, as I think you are, to sort of well, at least various aspects of animal rights movements. I think human beings are pretty horrible to animals, and we really are not living up to our very clear moral obligations not to torment other sentient beings. I disagree with the therefore with the view sometimes attributed to Descartes, according to which if you accept his arguments, then you're going to think that other animals are just unconscious mechanisms. There's a big debate about whether Descartes ever thought that. On my reading, I think maybe he does. Maybe that's one respect in which I think his opponents have been right, although they go to bizarre lengths in maligning him on other points that aren't justified. Nick Zangwill, a colleague of mine at Lincoln, has assured me that I'm wrong about that, and so now I don't know what to think. But what are the consequences for non-humans? Well, it seems to me in the case of non-human animals, probably the consequences of dualism are not very great. We have very good grounds to think, both on the basis of observable similarity and on the basis of common ancestry, that there are going to be very close parallels between what's going on for us as sentient beings and what's going on for other animals. So the natural assumption is that whether you're a dualist or not, other animals that seem fairly like us, that have a common ancestry, we have very good reasons to think they're going to be undergoing conscious experience too. And then all the brilliant literature that's been coming out lately on animal consciousness fills in that starting point in a way that in my opinion, is just neutral on the dualism question.
Yeah, so roughly the reasons for thinking animals are conscious are just whatever we already thought they were. And then the arguments for dualism imply that if we're conscious because we have this immaterial part, well, then animals must have some immaterial soul too. And it's interesting because I think people in popular debates often assume that dualists are committed to saying that like only humans have souls or something, like people you talk to on the internet or whatever. But I actually don't know of any substance dualist philosophers who don't agree with what I just said. Yeah, the same arguments that any conscious animals have souls.
Another case of psychophobia.
Right. But what about AI?
Well, so here I think that it becomes a little more tricky in the following respect. So at least for one version of physicalism, functionalism, so not the view that the conscious experiences are somehow physical, but we do not know how, it's some kind of mystery. But the view that we do know that the conscious experiences are ultimately functional states. They are a matter merely of inputs from the environment of the thing and the outputs it gives in response to its environment. On that view, we could know absolutely for sure not only that other animals are conscious, but also that machines are conscious. In fact, by definition, they're conscious if they behave as though they're conscious. Perhaps above a certain bar of sophistication, you could have different variants on the details of the view. And I don't think it seems to me at least some people thinking about AI at a pretty sophisticated level do just presuppose that view, or at least in some of their thinking. In my opinion, it's a ridiculous view, and my experience is people who hold ridiculous views usually hold them in some contexts only, and then in other contexts, including myself. Whereas if you're inclined to dualism or the other kind, the more popular kind of physicalism that says it is physical, but we don't really know how, then you have this important disanalogy with the case of animals where, yeah, we're working towards functional similarity, towards observable similarity with the way humans manifest our mental lives, but we do not have the common ancestry. So it seems to me those two major facts are going to give us less reason to think that even very sophisticated AIs have mental lives at all than animals. Certainly, I think, as someone who buys the dualist arguments, we will certainly not be able to be sure they're genuinely conscious because of the way they behave. But we will have what ordinarily one would think of as some evidence that they have mental lives on the basis of their observable similarity. And personally, so I have various sort of Luddite philosopher friends who are as I count myself as kind of one of them, who are a bit skeptical of transhumanism and of various contemporary trends in philosophy. But I think, unlike some of them, I'm personally, really very impressed with the latest developments in AI. I think it's, having read, the more popular books about this stuff for a few years, it really is true that the current large language models in particular are performing tasks which many people, even people who are optimistic about the future capabilities of AI, did not think was likely to come about anywhere near as soon as it has done. And so it seems to me this may not be the most important question now about AI, but it is a really seriously important question. Is the fact that we don't have this common ancestry enough to conclude that they are not actually conscious? Or is some other distinction between them and us and other sentient creatures enough to conclude that they're not actually conscious? And if neither of those is true, then it really has these massive practical consequences. I just don't think we're in a very good position to answer those questions now. I suspect, but we've got a little bit of time where we can be pretty sure at the moment the way in which they ape sentient and conscious behavior is sufficiently far from what we think is going on in actual sentient organisms that we can responsibly assume that there's no such thing as sentience or anything there. But in order to continue with that status quo, we do need a more sophisticated theory. And I don't know, I was at the Science of Consciousness conference in Taormina earlier this year, where David Chalmers gave a, characteristically persuasive, systematic, and broad paper looking at the reasons for thinking large language models could not be conscious within the next, I think, 10 years or something he was talking about. And he made a pretty good case for thinking, most of the arguments for thinking they can't have what look like plausible flaws in them. So I think, annoyingly, I don't think dualism helps us much. It'd be nice. I'd love it if we could say, and now we've proved dualism, we know that computers can't be conscious. But I don't think we do know. I think, we need to know more about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world as it manifests itself in our phenomenology, and we don't know much about that.
Yeah, that seems right to me. Dualism, it does at least leave open as a possibility that the AI would be a philosophical zombie, so to speak. But yeah, it seems most reasonable to me to think that at some level of functional organization, it will become conscious, and then the important question is, when does that happen? Because that is, that would carry important ethical implications. And
I can see routes towards more substantive arguments. Suppose my friend Benedict Gurker thinks that consciousness and agency are closely related. Maybe Martina Niederrümelin thinks that. If you think that, and then if you have a indeterministic conception of agency where you don't have genuine agency if there's not indeterminism, and the machines are deterministic, you might start to get some make some headway, but that's a long way downstream of where we are now. Just getting non-physicalist theories back on the table.
Yeah. What do you make of so just like there's kind of a deflationist response about personal identity to that argument for substance dualism I gave before. there's sort of a deflationist response to the whole line of argumentation for dualism that's been given here that you briefly mentioned, that basically more or less rejects the idea that we're conscious in the sense that you and I think we are. So, and there are different ways, this might explicitly be a denial that we're conscious. It might be, well, we're conscious, but not in this, maybe qualia or just the sense of what it's likeness. Maybe that's kind of a philosopher's fiction. Maybe we're under the illusion that we have these subjective states. One thing I said earlier, we can tell that drawing lines in a 2D plane is never going to produce a 3D object, but it can produce something that looks like a 3D object initially, right? So there's the mainstream school of thought that kind of more or less accepts the conception of consciousness we're working with, the mainstream physical school of thought, and says, but there's some brute necessity, for a reason we can't quite get. This is just physical. There's another that says, no, you're right about the implication of thinking of experience as this, subjective, private, intrinsic, what it's likeness, whatever. But that actually just doesn't exist. And so none of these arguments work because the alleged phenomena, sure, you're right about the implications, but the alleged phenomena doesn't even exist. What do you think about that line?
Yeah. So it's a line of reasoning. My impression is it's a line of reasoning that is becoming somewhat more prominent. In fact, even I sort of touched on this earlier. I think even some of the standard strategies which purport to take consciousness seriously, as it's put, and say, yeah, it's really there. Once you go into the details, what they're actually saying is there's no such thing. So the phenomenal concept strategy seems to say that our phenomenal concepts are empty labels that have no consequence for the qualitative character or the intrinsic nature of the things they label. Well, if that's right, then it looks like you're not necessarily committed to anything more than someone who says, no, that we're just mistaken. It's just an illusion that there's a subjective conscious experience which is only knowable to the person undergoing it and all the rest of it. As people like Descartes and Chalmers conceive of it. So I think this is a view that may be slightly more mainstream than it looks like at first. At the same time, those people who supposedly endorse this view, or who are often said to endorse this view, maybe the Churchlands earlier, Keith Frankish now, all terrific people, I should add, despite being totally wrong, and brilliant thinkers and interesting and so on. My own impression is they tend often to seem to go back on it. So when they're in a debate and someone says that's really interesting, so you think there's this really powerful illusion that there's this subjective state, but it's not really there. I'm not really, and they no, of course you are undergoing, you taste the claret and you see the room around you and so forth, and this is, and so it's often very hard to pin down exactly who is endorsing the deflationary view, where ordinarily we think there's something that exists and we're just radically wrong, and who's endorsing a kind of reductionist view where no, the thing we ordinarily think exists really does exist, and maybe a few people misinterpret it. Now, my basic thought about both of these physicalist positions is that it seems to me they're very clearly wrong. The arguments for them seem to me so poor as not really to warrant much attention, at least the causal closure argument in particular is the leading one. And I think I can see why these positions have become popular despite having very little in their favor. My impression again is that this oscillation between two versions of the view is symptomatic of the fact that there is no good version of the view. If you really stuck to saying there's no consciousness, everyone would know you were crazy. If you really stuck to saying consciousness just is being responsive to your environment in various physical ways, everyone would know you were crazy. Yeah. I suppose that wasn't really the right pair. The second one is maybe it's that or some nervous tissue state where we just can't explain why one thing is the other. In any case, yeah. So I think there's a really good explanation for the attraction to oscillate between these two kinds of views. But I think when you distill one of them consistently, it really doesn't look attractive. And dialectically, moving from one to another is obviously no good. What we need from physicalists, and it would be, of course, great to get it, is a really clear, crisp theory where we look at it and we say, aha, yeah, that explains why we're under this persistent illusion and why it would feel like it does to be under it in an ultimately physicalistically acceptable way. Or, aha, that's why we're not under an illusion. We really are conscious, but our conscious experience really does not require anything more than neurons firing in certain patterns or particles and fields interacting in certain ways.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a difficult position to argue against. It particularly in the more straightforwardly extreme forms, just for the reason that in general, when people reject very foundational assumptions, it's hard to argue against them because it's hard to figure out what could be more plausible that might be shared ground that you could use as an argument. And so, yeah, when I say that I've experienced qualia,
it might not be that important to argue against. Like we're trying to work out what we think is most plausible. I don't feel a need to persuade everyone else.
Right.
And yeah, well, you want to know why people think what they think. Sometimes it's hard to work that out.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes you just have to accept you're not going to work it out.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this a fair amount because I'm much to my own misfortune, a co-inventor of an argument called the argument from psychophysical harmony for theism, and it's gotten a fair amount of attention on the internet, and some of the attention has been high quality. Much of it has not been high quality, but one way to escape the argument is to adopt type A physicalism or limited materialism or whatever. And I think as a result, we may be convinced some people online to just, oh, well, I'll just be a type A physicalist then. and I'm kind of like, well,
one man's nodus ponens is another man's nodus
ponens. But
I know the argument. Philip Goff discusses this in his recent right and so on. Yeah. No, I was thinking about it the other day, and I think I was talking about it in the pub as well here in Warsaw. Well, that's not a real pub, it's Poland, but in the bar. I think it's really interesting and, so far as I can tell, persuasive and novel argument, which does push the materialist towards type A physicalism, because on the type B view it does seem so inexplicable that the conscious states should match up with so appropriately with their roles.
Yeah. There's, for people watching, I've talked about it in other videos. If you Google search it, or Brian Cutter and I have a paper coming out that people can find online. Is this? Oh yeah. So
you have lots of papers coming out, right? I was looking at your CV. You've got I think I've got about maybe 6 forthcoming pieces on my CV, which feels like quite a lot to have. Sort of, you've got about maybe 15.
Yeah, some of those are now out, and I just haven't updated my website. But I did this 2-year-long postdoc in Germany, and COVID happened, and I was very productive. So I had a stretch of 7 months where I had a paper accepted every month, and so I got this big.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's pretty special.
Yeah, now I'm mostly doing other stuff, running this nonprofit. But turning back to the question of, as we prepare to wrap up, turning back to the question of objections to dualism, the most popular philosophically is this causal closure argument that says, look, laws of nature determine what happens. There's no room in those for a non-physical substance to interact. And I take it your response to that is something like, well, there are first of all some non-interactionist forms of dualism, but then also like it's not like anybody ever actually, it's not like somebody has scanned our brains and like concluded that every particle is moving in accordance with the laws of nature, right? The idea that our brains are causally closed is kind of an inductive inference, but like the theory is that your brain is where there's interaction with this non-physical substance. So the inductive inference is kind of question begging, because like if causal closure was going to break down, it would be like right here, right, where the non-physical substance is interacting. So what non-question begging reason is there to think that there isn't a violation of the natural laws? And of course, there also are people who have argued that given indeterminism, maybe there can be interaction consistent with the natural laws or whatever. But so at best, maybe it's true that there aren't like super obvious violations of causal closure. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, so we also have to wrap up because I'll lose my voice. But there aren't super obvious violations of causal closure. Maybe that's a little bit of evidence, but not too much. I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this. I wrote when I was doing the B.Phil over at Oxford. This was the focus of my dissertation, and it wasn't, the result wasn't great, I think, but it was sort of good enough that I thought about it in a lot of detail and continue to do so. I don't really discuss it in the book because there I mainly focus on property dualists who face the same problem. However, it does seem to me this is a surprisingly influential argument, given how poorly supported its most important, I think really its only important premise is, which is that, yeah, we know that in the case of animate organisms such as ourselves, everything we do is caused by a chain of sufficient physical causes. First of all, I mean, so there's two kinds of evidence that are put forward for this view. One, an inference from fundamental physics. We can tell that everything in fundamental physics, leaving out apparent quantum indeterminism, obeys this principle. And then we infer from that case to the case of animate organisms. Well, as I think I said earlier, this inference is entirely question-begging if you're using it to argue against someone who's given you reasons for thinking there might be a difference between the dynamics of these two systems, inanimate matter and animate organisms. It would be a bit like sort of, walking down a train and checking whether each carriage is occupied and seeing that they're not. And then your friend says, oh, the next one is occupied. And you say, no, it can't be. I've checked all the others. And your friend says, yeah, but the others, we could see through the window they were empty anyway. Whereas in this one, there's someone there. You say, no, I've checked 100 now. This one's going to be empty too. It would just be irrelevant data. The other evidence putatively comes from neuroscience, but it's negative evidence. It's the fact that neuroscientists have not noticed departures from physical behavior consistent with only the four fundamental physical forces operating: strong and weak nuclear force, electromagnetic force, and gravitational force. As David Papineau puts it, the main proponent of this argument. However, I don't believe it's even controversial that the regularities we know about in neuroscience are highly indeterministic, have not been reduced to those four fundamental forces. In fact, in neuroscience, we just don't think about things in terms of these fundamental physical forces. If you asked a physicist to measure the goings-on in your brain and then make a prediction on the basis of physical laws about what's going to happen next, they'd laugh. Of course, we can't do anything like that. So it seems to me this is a strange case where, unlike in the establishment of Einstein's theory of relativity or heliocentrism about the cosmos, where you have these great scientific insights where we can point to the observations and inferences that showed us, aha, we've got this new insight into the way reality is. In the case of causal closure, all you ever get is a very vague story about what hasn't been observed in the history of science. There's no core experiment or anything like that. And then you mentioned, well, okay, but at least the fact that neuroscientists haven't observed any radical departure from ordinary physical regularities gives us a little bit of evidence that there's nothing extra going on in the brain. I think that's basically right, but we need to make two caveats. The first is that it's it's widely thought of or recognized as a general law that nature doesn't like redundancies. There's this law of least effort that seems to be fairly fundamental in the way the natural world works. So if we thought there were something else going on, it would be natural to suppose that it would not be really radical. It would just be enough to tip the balance of what's going on in the brain in such a way as to bring about the results that we observe. And that might be very little in a complex system like the brain. So I think if a proponent of causal closure argument wants to make it a good argument, one thing they could usefully do, and it'd be interesting to try, would be to argue that if there were these non-physical forces, we should expect them to be observable in ordinary neuroscience, to be pretty hefty, like one part of the brain suddenly lights up in fire, or whatever. The second thing is, it's not true that what we observe in the brain strikes us as like really obviously explicable in terms of ordinary forces. In fact, we assume it is if we're working in the standard naturalistic paradigm, and that's perfectly fine for getting on with brain science. But it's actually the case that brains are pretty unusual systems which constantly surprise and confuse specialists on neuroscience. And there has been no systematic effort to identify the causal chain that results in, for example, voluntary action in the brain, tracing it back step by step by step, and giving a coherent physicalist story about how it comes about. There's a paper coming out by a guy called Alin Christoph Cucu, a Romanian philosopher, in the journal Mind and Matter, I think, soon. I've seen a preprint of this thing, where he discusses, like, here's the basic, here's what we know from neuroscience, but you trace back the neuroscience, you get to this eruption of activity, I think, in the basal ganglia, and we don't actually have a story about how that comes about. And he goes through various physical options and explains why none of these is really very satisfactory. So I think, look, we could probably do better than that. I suspect, it'd be really great if the observations were unambiguously in favor of physicalism or unambiguously against it. But our epistemic situation's often not so great. So I suspect if we look further, it's not going to be really clear either way from the observations we can make. But at the moment, we're just so far from the kind of evidence you'd need for the causal closure argument to be persuasive, that I think the fact that it's so widely accepted, it must be merely symptomatic of the antecedent popularity of its conclusion.
Right. So because I want to let you go soon, I'm going to ask a final multi-part question, including my remaining concerns, and you can answer at whatever length you like. So I think another argument that's probably more popular among ordinary people than the causal closure argument is just sort of an argument for mind-brain dependence, from mind-brain dependence, that's just like, look, you get hit in the head, you can't speak properly anymore or whatever. Doesn't that show that there's not a soul? Hard to exactly get what the inference there is, but and then another is really just sort of a vibes-based argument, that it seems like somehow this view fits poorly with the modern scientific worldview, with, it seems too reminiscent of other things that sophisticated people don't believe in anymore, et cetera. And that's probably really, I think, what moves most people. And that ties into, another issue, the final part of the multi-part question, which is, you've said that one reason you're interested in this topic is because it maybe has broader implications for our view of the world, our view of ourselves, our place in the world, etc. And so what do you think, if somebody winds up being sympathetic to dualism, what do you think are some of those broader implications potentially for how they should fit that into everything else?
Well, you have to prostrate yourself before the divine and beg for mercy. Uh, yeah. So I think, so to start with the first part of the question about the mind-brain dependence, I think mind-brain dependence, provides a little bit of very defeasible evidence for against dualism. I'd say it probably goes no further than it's consistent with non-dualism, which, all other things being equal, is the more economical position. It doesn't go much further than that. I mean, you read the Iliad, Homer was well aware that if you bash someone on the head, that they might stop being conscious for a while. That's why they wear helmets. This is not news. We know about mind-brain dependence, and yet most cultures have not seen that as good reason to doubt the immateriality of the mind or soul. Two things can be intimately related causally without being one and the same. It's also, of course, the case that there's lots of apparent mind-brain independence, which if we decided dualism were true, we might start to take a little more serious and think, well, maybe in a near-death experience, maybe people do undergo conscious states that for that period are not directly dependent on their brain. I really don't know what we should think about. I don't see those cases as doing a lot of evidential work for me, but I'm not sure what exactly we should think about them beyond that. The vibes-based argument, yeah. I mean, in a way, if that's the real reason why people reject my view, then it might be that they're being, completely rational, right? There are coherentist or I'd prefer semi-coherentist views about epistemology that are deeply plausible, according to which, if you encounter an apparent new datum that fits badly with your wider view, it makes more sense to assume it's a mistake of some kind. Yeah, I do think that for many people it's a vibes-based resistance to the view. However, if that's right, I suspect many of the background assumptions on which it's based under interrogation would turn out not to be very well grounded either, meaning that there's room for, or there's potential for, a kind of natural phase shift in one's perspective on these questions, whereby if you start to take seriously, well, maybe consciousness is not physical, maybe we do have free agency, or whatever it might be, it starts to look like, well, I can maintain the coherence of my overall view and actually do away with a lot of pretty weird looking discontinuities between the opinion and the apparent evidence for it and so forth. But it changes the wider system. And I think we see evidence of that in the way intellectual factions sort of group together. It's not the case that there's sort of two views on each philosophical issue and everyone takes either view A or view B. Things are much more complicated than that. But you do see groupings which seem to reflect these internally coherent systems of views which are resistant to any single argument against them. And I think if we look beyond academia, you do see, so in recent Western intellectual culture, since arguably the end of the 19th century in Western Europe elite circles, and then since the middle of the 20th century, in Western European and American and broader Western intellectual circles, generally far beyond the elite sort of educated people. And then maybe by the 1990s, people in the Western world, educated people in the Western world, generally by and large, have adopted this naturalistic conception of the world. It's a bit like ancient Epicureanism without the redeeming feature of having libertarian free will. And there are all sorts of extremely complicated reasons why that happened, from religious anxiety in Central Europe in the fall of the Habsburg Empire, and to the logical positivists, the Lviv-Warsaw School, the rise of communism, and all sorts of things feed into this broad movement that has left us with, by the end of the 21st century, this kind of standard common sense opinion on the world that seems so unquestionable that even when you don't really have a good argument against one, response to an argument against one part of it, you feel like, well, you can be pretty sure the argument's going wrong somewhere. These people are crazy. The psychological factors that make us do that might be beneficial. Group agreement is useful in various respects and so on. But of course, it's worth recognizing that we're massive outliers in this respect. This is the only culture in the whole history of the world that has converged on materialism. And although we have this nice explanation for that, well, it's because of physical science. When you look at the arguments for materialism, they don't seem any better than those that Democritus or Epicurus or Lucretius or Hobbes had historically. It's clearly, I think, something else that has led us to converge on that kind of a view. If we're actually wrong to have that view as the sort of standard view, as I argue, then I do think it is likely to have wider consequences for our conception of reality and our place in it. I'm very much sympathetic to Philip Goff's recent arguments that if you look at all the data with a fair mind, you're going to end up somewhere closer to traditional theism than you are to the atheist position that tends to dominate among Western intellectuals. I suspect you're going to end up taking morality and aesthetics a lot more seriously than you are if you think of these as in some way reducible to our personal preferences, perhaps idealized somewhat in the case of morality for the sake of impartiality and so on. Yeah, I think well, in a way, it's kind of obvious answer. If on this very fundamental metaphysical issue you give up the current popular view in the modern Western intellectual culture and adopt the view that has been prominent at more or less all other times and places, it's likely that in some other respects you'll be attracted to views more like those adopted in all other times and places. It's still going to leave you a huge amount of leeway. Yeah. But it's liable to be a big difference at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Do you have any closing thoughts? Anything else? Maybe we've covered everything.
No, I think we've covered everything that could possibly be said on this topic. I think we really got that. But thank you so much for inviting me on. It's been a really great discussion.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.